All right, Kathy, you're good to go.
All right. Well, good evening. My name is Kathy Fuentes Rohr, and I'm the president of the Indiana Coalition for Public Education, or ICPE. We are a nonpartisan, volunteer-run organization seeking to inform our communities about the issues facing public schools and the concerted attack through the efforts to privatize them. We hope that with information and understanding, our community members will be empowered to advocate on behalf of public education for all of our children. Why does this matter? Unlike other schools that may take public funding, our truly, or sometimes called traditional public schools, accept all children. Indiana's Constitution guarantees our children a free public education paid for through our tax dollars. Public schools are the heart of our community. It's where we gather on Friday nights for basketball or to watch a school play. Children from all different backgrounds come together and learn to respect and value their differences, find common ground, and get along with one another. These are essential skills for their future and our collective future. Public schools are our social responsibility and our common good. But the efforts to undermine this common good fall under the policy euphemistically called school choice, a free markets idea that competition creates a better product, and in this case, our kids' education. Our state legislature has created an environment in which our public tax dollars, funds intended for all children, are now siphoned into private hands to educate a comparative few. Since 2011, when vouchers first became law, over $1.4 billion have been spent on vouchers to private schools that do not have to follow the same laws that public schools do, nor do they have to accept the same kids. Charter schools, which are privately run but publicly funded, have expanded significantly during this time period, draining more resources from our traditional public schools. We do not blame families for choosing the schools that serve their children best, but as Indiana's legislature has failed to fully fund public schools to keep up with inflation, as the pressure of this competition has created increased stress and micromanaging of the classroom alongside the draining of resources, we must ask ourselves, at what cost? What are the intended or unintended consequences of these policies? Over the past decade, we have seen ever increasing shortages of teachers, support staff, and school leaders, and we need to ask ourselves, is competition appropriate for education? Competition involves winners and losers. Should a 6-year-old be on the losing end of a competition for equal educational opportunity? And what is lost with the loss of the public in education? Most importantly, what do our children lose? Over the next hour, you will learn more about what this privatization effort looks like in Indiana, and will hopefully understand why it matters. Maybe you'll come away with more questions. We want this conversation to continue even after our event. Please take a look at our resources in a follow-up email and survey after tonight, and feel free to reach out to any of us after the panel. I would like to thank our co-sponsors, our friends at ISTA, the Indiana State Teachers Association, and the Indianapolis Public Schools Community Coalition for helping us make this event happen. To start us on this conversation and to facilitate the discussion with our guests, we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Monica Medina, clinical professor at the Indiana University School of Education, Indianapolis. Dr. Medina is a participatory action researcher, civic engaged faculty member, author of multiple professional journal articles, and speaker about Latino issues, about diversity, equity, family, and community engagement in our public schools, among so many other projects and roles she's taken on in her career. She supervises student teachers in local schools and has a deep understanding of the important work done in our public schools and in our efforts to serve all children. It's my pleasure to turn this over to Dr. Medina.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all of you joining us this evening. We have a very interesting webinar for you today. We have two wonderful speakers who will speak about the privatization of education. We will hear from both of the speakers, Dr. Cohen, who is the author of The Privatization of Everything, and Dr. Gail Cosby, and I'll introduce both of them in a minute. We also want to make sure that you have the opportunity to ask questions So those questions can be placed in the Q&A little box at the bottom of your screen. My co-host for this evening, or co-facilitator, is Rosin Jackson, who is a teacher here with Indianapolis Public Schools. She will also, at the end of our presentation, will offer hope. And so you'll get an opportunity to also learn about how do we move forward? What is the call to action? So let me first begin by talking a little bit about our first speaker, who is Donald Cohen. And he is the founder and the executive director of the Research and Policy Center in the public interest, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that is based in Oakland. This organization studies public education, infrastructure, social services, and other public good. He is the founding board member of Power Switch, formerly Partnership for Working Families, and also the author of the book that we're going to talk a lot about this evening, titled The Privatization of Everything. Our second speaker is Dr. Gail Cosby, and she is a product of urban public schooling, a former elementary special education teacher in an urban setting. And she has served as a publicly elected school board member with the Indianapolis Public Schools. Her professional agenda is committed to social justice and equity in education, specifically for marginalized communities. In her work, she has written about community, about preparing future teachers, but more important, she has just completed her PhD, and the title of her dissertation is Bought But Not Sold Out, a critical ethnography of a public school board member in a neoliberal turn. Thank you both for joining us today. And if you would like to begin, Mr. Cohen, with a short description of your ideas of what's happening here.
Okay. Well, thank you. And no, I'm not a doctor. I'm just you can call me Donald from here on in. So I wrote a book called The Privatization of Everything. I'll show you what it looks like for those who can all see. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the big picture. I mean, even before I get to education, I'm going to give some other examples. So first, I'm going to start by saying how I define privatization. I have a very specific definition. I say it is private control over public goods. You know, I'm going to break that down a little bit. Because first off, what do I mean by public goods? Public goods, again, this is my definition. If there is a textbook economics definition, which is different, but this is what I would call the democratic definition, that we should be able to decide what are public goods. And I believe they are the things that we all need to survive, and to thrive and to get through life. And secondly, they're the things that we need everyone to have. So we need everyone to be, I want to be healthy and I want to have access to healthcare, but I need everyone to have access to healthcare. And I think we learned that through the pandemic. The health of all of us depends on the health of each of us. Whether we have children in school or not, we need an educated population. So I want my grandkids now to have a good education, but I need every kid to have a good education. So that, so that's water, food, knowledge, education, healthcare, sort of a whole transportation, the ability to move around. I think today we could say broadband is sort of an essential thing that we all need to survive. And the basic idea is that we get to decide what those things are. So that's the public good part. The private control is exercised in a variety of ways. And I'm going to give some examples of that. It does not mean no contracting, no government contracting. It means who's in charge. And I'm going to give some examples because it's easier to do it that way. Not about education at first. Now you're all in Indiana, so some of you may know this story from Chicago. In the year 2008, when when all cities were, the Great Recession, all cities were really suffering fiscally, the mayor of Chicago at the time, Daley, announced a proposal from a consortium of global corporations to take over the city's 36,000 parking meters for 75 years in exchange for $1.1 billion up front. So they were going to give the city $1.1 billion, and a city in desperate need of cash in exchange for those control of the parking meters. Then they voted very quickly after the proposal was announced, so there wasn't much time for scrutiny. That happened after the fact. And two things became true afterwards, after the Inspector General and others kind of analyzed this long, very complicated 75-year contract. That's to 2083, just to put that in your head. Two things were true. One is incredibly stupid way to borrow money on future revenues, right? Parking meter revenues. Anybody, we all borrow money on the future because that's how we buy houses. Incredibly stupid way to do that. 75 years, who knows if we're going to be driving, right? But secondly, and far more important, is that the city now, for the remaining 61 years of the contract, or whatever, something like that, if they want to eliminate parking spots temporarily for a street fair, but more significantly, permanently for bike lanes or bus rapid, dedicated bus lanes or pedestrian malls, because they want to change land use patterns and, reduce traffic and other things. If they want to do any of those things and remove spots, they have to buy them back. So what that means to me, what that says, the reason I tell this story is that the contract, that long-term contract, eliminates and ties the hands of the elected leadership of the town to make decisions, to do their job. What's their job? Housing and land use and transportation and climate and clean air and all of that. So that's why at its core, I say privatization is an assault on democracy. It takes away, it gives control and power and authority over those public things by virtue of a contract. So that's one example. The second example I want to give is about the weather. So we all use our weather apps on our phone or look online or the Weather Channel or what have you. And it's important to know that all of the data that we look at, all the original data we pay for, comes from the National Weather Service. It's all publicly data made freely available to everyone, including businesses and corporations that then take it and package it and offer extra services to others, to the weather, to the news, but also to corporations. So the example I want to give here is there's one of the major companies called AccuWeather. You may be familiar with them. A lot of us are. There was a tornado in Oklahoma, I think it was 1914 or 15, something like that. And one of AccuWeather's clients or customers was Union Pacific, the rail company, right? And they, for extra warning, early warnings of tornadoes and kind of other things, totally legit business. So I want to read a quote from what the CEO of AccuWeather said when he was interviewed on TV and he was promoting his services. He said, let me find it. Okay. After describing what happened in the tornado, 2 trains stopped 2 miles apart. They watched the tornado go between them. This is me now. An absolutely good thing. He goes on. Unfortunately, it went into a town that didn't have our service and a couple of dozen people were killed. But the railroad did not lose anything. So the reason one, it's horrifying. It's a horrifying story. But the point of that is that's what markets do. Markets exclude. You sell things to market. Markets. Entities or organizations in the market only sell things to people who have the money to buy them. Being safe in a tornado is not something that should depend on how much money you have. So that's sort of the point there is about markets. The third story, and then I'm going to get into education quickly, is about healthcare. Medicaid was privatized in Iowa and Kansas. So one of the things we hear all the time is, well, businesses are more efficient. They can do things better and cheaper and faster. We hear that in all kinds of things. And there may be some truth in some cases, in other cases not. Some are efficient, some are not, just like governments and agencies. So but here's what's important to know. and I'm not against business. I mean, we have a lot of private healthcare in the country, but the executives of those companies made millions, I looked at their compensation packages, millions of dollars in, each year. So that's, maybe they deserve it. I'm not evaluating that, but that's money that went out of the service. Then they had, returns to investors because they're public companies and they're invested on the stock market. And then they had probably other business expenses. All of those dollars are leaving the service. So if they're going to be more efficient, which means they're going to spend less on something else, there's very few things they can spend less on. And in this case, it was healthcare. So if people got less care. So that's when sort of I tell this because efficiency means less money in for more out. And we can all think of things we can do more efficiently. But really important to ask a really important question when people say it's going to be more efficient when you privatize something is, what are you going to spend less money on? Because it may not be something we want you to spend less money on. Quality of service, wages and working conditions, number of staff, et cetera. So now let me go in deeper. I think I'm okay on time. I lost track of the time. I want to talk about charter schools and markets. So the original idea of charter schools, fine. It was good, actually. Create laboratories of innovation and then share the results, right? But here's what's happened to that. Now it's a market thing where, as Kathy said earlier, there's competition. The charter schools are competing for enrollment from the schools, the public schools in their neighborhood and the other charters. So teachers, it's not universally, but we found a number of them. Teachers, as a condition of employment in charter schools, are asked to sign NDAs or non-disclosure agreements and non-compete agreements that they won't go to another charter, a competing charter. So those NDAs basically say that the teacher will not share the school's trade secrets, and because they're proprietary and that's their secret sauce. What are those trade secrets? Curriculum, lesson plans, teaching methods, the very things that we need to share, right? And what the original idea of charters were to share so that every student, if you come up with a great idea, we should all be able to benefit from it. That again is what markets do. Because when you're competing, you don't want to share your secret sauce, your special, thing with others. So that's part of the, there are other distortions that happens in competition where we can do that in questions and answers. Finally, let me just finish with a few quick points about the impact. The impact of charters and vouchers. Let me stick with charters so I can just say one word. The money, though there are many who think, well, charters are providing good options and choice for other folks, and they think that public schools need to be improved, and maybe in some cases they do. We should always be improving our public schools. But what happens when kids go from a public school to a charter is all the money goes with the kid to the charter, but all the cost doesn't. We did research in California with 3 school districts and found millions of dollars a year net were being lost by the schools, by the school districts. So what that says to me is, if you want to improve the schools and you're genuinely, maybe you're a charter supporter or, believe in markets or whatever, but you have an idea of improving the schools, there is no reform effort that includes taking away their money, right? Because that's what's happening, that's bleeding. These schools are being forced into failure. Let me stop there and hand it over to Gail, and then we can kind of get into, because she can take us into the weeds and, into the experiences in Indiana in a very real way.
Into the weeds indeed. So to kind of bring many of Donald's points into a more local perspective, I'd like to share with you a little bit of my story and some of the things that I learned in my journey. So as Dr. Medina mentioned, I am a former IPS teacher. And when I say IPS, I should illuminate that means Indianapolis Public Schools. I'm a product of Indianapolis Public Schools K through 12. My children have attended Indianapolis Public Schools. And I've been an East Side resident practically my entire life. And so this is woven into the fabric of who I am. And it's not just me, but generations of my family before me attended IPS as well. And so with all of that kind of background and all of those linkages to the district, in 2012, I decided to run for a seat on the IPS school board. And an interesting time. So a year prior to my bid for a school board seat, an organization called Stand for Children had set up shop in the Indianapolis area. Stand for Children, if you're not familiar, is technically a nonprofit 501c3 organization, but it is also a 501c4 organization that typically gets very heavily involved in local elections, namely school board elections. And unbeknownst to me, that's kind of why they had come and set up shop when they did. And so in 2012, in deciding to run for a school board seat, I began in a very grassroots way. I was hoping to unseat someone who had held that seat for, I think, somewhere around 3 decades. And, had a very entrenched and just was a very solid community figure. And so my work began very early. There were a lot of kitchen table conversations. There was a lot of, planning very early on. However, Stand for Children did become involved later in the game. And ultimately, I ended up accepting their endorsement. So what does that look like? Well, in 2012, it essentially meant I lost control of my own campaign process. So all the grassroots stuff I had done in the beginning kind of just, they took that and ran with it. But ultimately what it meant was that a kitchen table campaign, and we're talking about, the history of IPS school board campaigns up until 2012, they were all kitchen table campaigns. We're talking about something that could be won, a seat that could have been won with, $500 or $1,000. In 2012, I reported $78,000 on my campaign finance report. So just with the appearance of this one organization in the city and this focus on, getting in control of the local school board, there was this explosion of money that came on the scene in that year. But that's just what I reported on my campaign finance report. Let's be real. There was a lot of spending going on behind the scenes. Other organizations and players were involved in that spending. And I would say there was well in excess of $100,000 behind the scenes that was spent in addition to the $78,000 that was reported. And so 2012 was the pivotal year that privatization came to roost in Indianapolis, if you will, okay? Some of the other folks you may be curious, or organizations, both on paper and behind the scenes, the Chamber of Commerce was involved. There was an organization called Indiana Democrats for Education Reform, Stand for Children, of course. But I got money from as far away as Walton family members of Walmart fame. I got money from Reed Hastings of Netflix fame. I got money from Michael Bloomberg, former New York City mayor. And you may be asking yourself, why would these folks be interested in a seat representing the east side of Indianapolis, on the public school board? And so I think that, that's the understanding that we're coming into. Why is this of interest? And so, interestingly, I'll back up just a bit. I got elected, obviously, but I joined 3 individuals who were elected in 2010. And so, though I was supported by certain individuals and organizations and all that, I ultimately decided that I was representing the people who had voted for me, right? So when I joined that board, and I joined with 3 individuals that had that kitchen table campaign experience, that very grassroots experience, I resonated more with those individuals than with the folks that were bought and paid for in the 2012 election. And so we had a couple years of positivity, actually. But when those folks that were elected in 2010 came up for re-election in 2014, of course, they were faced with the same circumstances that I was a part of, the big money, and they lost their campaigns. And so in 2014, that's when things got very interesting. There was a charter school who had already been established as a standalone charter in the city of Indianapolis that wanted to partner with Indianapolis public schools. And so what we have now, it's not just charter. In Indianapolis, we have charter and public hybrids, which even further blur the lines of what is public and what is private. But the last thing that we voted on, the 2010 crew that I was with, we voted down a proposal for a charter school that wanted to partner with IPS that gave them a free building. It provided the salaries for all special education and support staff. It provided lawn maintenance service. It provided food service. It provided transportation. Think about the cost of all of these things, folks. This is all taxpayer money that we are funding private entities with. The biggest problem that I have with this blurring of the lines between public and private is there are some pretty egregious salaries in the charter school world. And when I talk about this, I'm talking about CEOs. I'm not knocking a principal or a teacher, believe me. The money is not there. The money is not in the classroom. It's not at the school oftentimes. It sometimes even leaves the state of Indiana to go to a CEO who lives in another state, maybe manages a couple of schools here from afar, right? This particular charter school operator CEO salary exceeded the superintendent of IPS salary by over $100,000. Now, the superintendent of Indianapolis Public Schools oversees 60 plus schools, roughly 60 schools. And here's this person living out of state with 2 or 3 charters that's making up $100,000 more than someone who is overseeing an entire district. This is a problem for me. And if you're a taxpayer and you pay into your local public school system, it should be a problem for you too, if you're following the money. So as I understand, to kind of bring this full circle, and I understand there's some opportunity to answer some questions in the chat as well. We are in a place in Indianapolis right now, and some of you, and I understand this is a statewide event, and so not everyone is in Indianapolis. And I also understand that you might be watching this from another city in Indiana and think, well, it's an Indianapolis problem. And I'm here to tell you that I think that Indianapolis is ground zero for Indiana, similar to how New Orleans was ground zero for charter schools in the country. But it's all about opportunity, right? And so if you read about the history of charter schools, you find, well, New Orleans was primed, and there is a wonderful author by the name of Naomi Klein. She talks about disaster capitalism. And New Orleans post-Katrina was just that opportunity for ground zero to happen here in the US with charter schools. But why? Why charter schools? Why New Orleans? Why big urban centers? Why are these places targeted first? Well, it appears to me to be based on the fact that many of our major urban centers are and have been for a little while undergoing a process called gentrification. And so gentrification is the process by which we had we had desegregation, right? How many decades has it been since we, desegregation laws came into existence? There was busing, there was efforts to integrate our school systems. This was in the 60s, right? And so many places were slower to get on board with that. Indianapolis, for example, didn't really get on board until 1981. That's a sidebar. The main point I'm making here is this has come full circle. The urban centers segregated racially. Black and brown children were left to attend schools in the urban centers, while those with means left, called white flight. I'm sure you've heard of it. But we're now at a place in which history is coming full circle and folks are returning to the urban centers. And this poses a problem for some families who may be concerned about where their child is going to attend school. Okay, and so that voluntary segregation or that self-segregation that's persisting, even though we have made efforts over the last several decades to reintegrate ourselves, has created an opportunity for schools to crop up, right? And so even in IPS, charters, non-charters, innovation network schools, what have you, it doesn't really matter. We still don't see a lot of white children attending schools alongside Black and brown children. We just don't. And that's where we are. And so I think that is, we're at this place of self-segregation. It's voluntary, but Donald actually has a chapter devoted to it in his book. So I would recommend that you visit that chapter or read the book. It's awesome book. That's why you see it in the urban core, but don't think that it won't come to you eventually. I think that any public school district, any taxpayer-funded school district needs to be aware that this is happening. It may not be happening to you or in your city right now, but rest assured that there is the possibility that it can come to you where you're located. And so as we go forward, we'll answer some questions and we will eventually get to talking about some solutions that we need to pay attention to and need to be mindful of and be aware of as we think about these issues and how they affect our communities.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions or several questions in the chat, and I want to direct one specifically to Donald that is related to some news that we received today. So how does today's Supreme Court ruling about funding for private schools affect public schools? Can you answer that?
Yeah. So I haven't studied the ruling and I'm starting to look at some of the responses to it, but I think that the simple answer is that it creates opportunity for folks for students and families that are in religious schools to get money, get public money that would normally go to the public schools, right? Where they weren't before. They were paying tuition and now they're not, then there'll be an opportunity for them not to pay tuition, but to avoid tuition and get paid to go to a religious school. But the other thing, it kind of opens the door for folk, it sort of slowly, it's just one, drip, 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 creating ways for kids to leave the public district schools, take with them the money from the school, and leave, again, like I said earlier, leave behind some of the costs. So, it's going to be a state by state, what happens is going to unfold state by state because the state will, as I understand what I heard on the news about the ruling, is that it'll depend a little bit on state statute and state constitutions of what's allowable. And so, but the push for vouchers, this is just sort of one more notch in the push for vouchers that we're seeing around the country is a way to, take away money from the schools. And as Gail was saying, continue to separate us into different market segments.
We have another question, and I'm going to, open this up to both of you. Surely some of you in the audience may also have responses to this, but the question states, your critique of charter schools oftentimes questionable policies and capacity to pull from limited public resources is valid. My question narrowly focuses on teachers. Charter schools provide basic employment and opportunities that are oftentimes unavailable to those same individuals in larger school districts. How do your individual visions for combating school privatization address the need to provide employment opportunities for the teachers who work in these buildings?
So to respond to that from the Indianapolis perspective, I would share that many of the teachers that are employed under the Innovation Network schools were formerly IPS teachers. So these teachers, just by the flick of a pen, went from being an employee of the public school district to being an employee of the charter school district, just because the agreement took place for their building. I would highlight that on average, I believe that charter schools pay a little less than public school districts. And to my understanding of the 23 Innovation Network schools that are in existence in Indianapolis, not one of them is a member of the ISTA, the Indiana State Teachers Association. So there is no union membership allowed in those employment settings. I think, others may be able to speak to this as well, but I have heard and understand the working conditions to be vastly different in those charter schools as well. So longer hours, extended contracts, just the working conditions are not comparable to those of public school systems in general.
Let me add one thing, because it's hard, I'm looking at the question as well, so it's a good question. But if we had an opportunity, the question I'd ask back is, why are these positions unavailable to teachers in the public district? Is it because there's not enough resources? If there's not enough resources, that answers a question there. We need more resources to public schools to be able to have smaller classes and all of that. If there's fewer, I'm just speculating. If it's lower standards, then I think what's really important is to raise the standards, right? Licensing standards and, standards, qualification standards for teachers. But teachers, no matter what school they're in, charters, public, private, no matter, they need to be paid well, they need to be compensated well, they need to be given the tools to teach and all of that. So, I would have to know more about the specifics to really say what's going on there.
And I do have, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please.
A question that's in the chat as well. And it could go to either Donald or Dr. Cosby. The person is asking, are charter school teachers required to follow the same licensing process as public school teachers?
I don't know Indiana statute, but so I don't know if you do.
Yeah,
Gail,
I can speak to it a little bit. So there's multiple pathways to getting a teacher licensure in the state of Indiana. You have the traditional 4-year bachelor degree route. However, there are alternative ways that you can now, alternative certification programs such as transition to teaching, in which you would, already have a bachelor's in something else and decide that you'd like to return and go through a teacher certification program to get a license to teach. So these have been in Indiana since 2007. TFA is one of them. Teach for America is the big one nationwide. And, there is a relationship, I think, between the charter school industry and TFA, or the alternative teacher licensure programs. You find high numbers of them in charters or Innovation Network schools, but they're everywhere, I think. And it's okay sometimes. It's okay sometimes, but you really cannot pack 4 years of pedagogy and instruction that would take you through the typical pathway into a one-year program, which is essentially what those are. Now, I say that, and I am a product of a alternative certification program. Mine culminated in a master's, and now I have a doctorate in education, but they are out there, they exist, and there are some serious concerns about teacher quality and the quality of the instruction that the students get when a teacher takes a fast track. In my experience, I did this. I was teaching after, I think it was 4 or 6 weeks, I was in a classroom. I took a summer institute and then I started teaching with an emergency permit that allowed me to go in and be a classroom teacher. So, and looking back on that, I didn't know anything. I didn't know what I didn't know, at that point. And so it depends on the person.
And every state is different. So, I mean, the thing about charters is it's less regulated. So there are less rules, there are fewer standards, which is part of the problem. We need to have rules and standards and all that to make sure that those charters, that charters can provide a quality education as well. But it's different in every state.
And there is another question. It's pertaining to the New Orleans school system. So again, either one of you guys can answer this question. It says that New Orleans was targeted because it was desperate for help after Katrina. I evacuated after Katrina. The city is still not up to the population before the hurricane. What are organizations doing to shut down Stand with Children? I know they have received a lot of criticism about turning education into a Walmart brand.
It's a fight that has to be fought wherever a Stand for Children is located. I do know that I believe it was Nashville, Tennessee, and I believe it was a few years back, but there were some skirmishes there in terms of Stand for Children's involvement in that local school board election. So, they are a very wealthy organization. They have a lot of resources. They have a lot of backing, like, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? Like, they have deep pockets and deep ties, but they're beholden to the same laws. And so, it just takes us, monitoring them and, being very vocal. We also, we'll get into this, but I think we need to be more engaged, civically engaged, and to know who's a Stand for Children candidate and who's not. I think it starts there.
Another question we have focuses on data. And the question says, is there recent data available that states how much money the state of Indiana spends on public schools, charter schools, and private schools, along with comparison of the number of students served?
I'm not aware of that data. It's not up here for me to cite like that, but I would imagine that a place to start researching that would probably be the Indiana Department of Education website. IDOE.gov, G-O-V.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a question in the chat that is specifically for you, Dr. Cosby. They said, did you ever feel pressure to follow the will of your funders when you were on the school board?
Yes, we broke up. I didn't tell that part of the story. Thank you for asking. We had a very messy breakup shortly after my election and taking the seat. I did notice that the folks that supported me monetarily during the campaign began to kind of pull my coattails here and there on certain issues, and wanted to meet with me a lot to talk about how I was going to vote on certain agenda items and things of that nature. And so the ugly breakup happened when I said, look, you supported me, or at least this is what I thought. You supported me because I was the best candidate for this seat. Not because I was gonna, do your bidding. And so my job now as a commissioner is to represent the people who voted for me. You didn't vote for me. You gave me some money, true indeed, but the people that voted for me are my constituents. And so that's how that breakup happened.
So we have another question. Is there truly any way to ever put the genie back into the bottle, given the role state politics play in school funding and the fact that the state leans so heavily Republican?
Mr. Cohen, what say you?
Well, so I would, the genie back in the bottle, you could, I do think there's a way to stop the growth of charters. I think, so that's number one. There are folks, that want to see, listen, there are folks that want to dismantle the public education system, and they see vouchers and charters as a way to do that, to create kind of parallel system, unregulated systems. But there are also places in the country that where in conservative places where voucher proposals did not succeed because they're, rural areas don't want to lose the resources in their schools, and other places didn't want to lose the resources. There are places where charter schools, there's a growing awareness that charters are, bleeding fiscally the public schools, that they segregate, that they discriminate, that some of the problems that there are for profits that are extracting resources that they shouldn't do. So there is, a union, and I just learned this weekend, the teachers union in Chicago, in their collective bargaining agreement, established a moratorium on charters, because I think it's really important to stop the growth, because the growth is the problem, right? Because if it's just growing, if you just can put a charter in every block, we're going to basically, it is literally forcing the public school system to fail and to eliminating. We just stop the growth. We could pass sensible regulations for charter schools so that the standards are the same, that we do share curriculum and ideas, that the school districts and others can kind of evaluate the needs of an entire community, charters and not, and to make sure that one's not harming another, that the charters are not harming the public schools. So there's a set of things that can be done. There are proposed regulations by the Biden administration that are moving through the regulatory process now that would actually help with that.
So there is a question. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
There is a question that in some ways responds to this question with another question. And that's the discussion on school boards. So how do we get school board elections back to the kitchen table level? And this person says, I feel like the ship has almost sailed in Indianapolis, where Stand for Children and the Mind Trust truly run IPS.
Yeah, it's so hard. So I am a member of the IPS Community Coalition. We are a grassroots organization that do work to encourage, grassroots folks, candidates, come forward, please. Anyone that is interested in potentially running for a school board seat, I would love to talk to you. IPS Community Coalition would love to talk to you. But if you're on the outside of that looking in and you're just like, well, who do I vote for? Notice who's endorsing who. I think following the money is important. If you haven't, I sent out 11 mailers during my campaign. People came up to me and were like, hey, you got my vote. Stop sending me mail. That wasn't me. That was all of the money people behind me that were sending out stuff without even asking my permission. It wasn't even a part of my campaign finance stuff. So if you see a campaign where it's just so bright and shiny and flashy, and they've got you know, they've got 11 mailers in your mailbox and they got people calling you every night, and they, you know, you see 25 people at the polls working for them and like all those signs, then you probably have identified the candidate that's backed by big money. Pay attention to smaller, you know, school board debates like IPS Community Coalition hosts. See who we endorse ultimately, see who the ISTA is endorsing, who is the IEA endorsing. You know, you just got to know who the players are in the game. But, you know, if you're in that place where you can volunteer, where you can donate your time, your money, your energy, whatever, into those candidates that are fighting that big money, that's where you can really make a difference.
Let me just add, it doesn't go back to the kitchen table in terms of budgets. That it doesn't. But I think that it starts with saying, yes, there are folks that want to dismantle the public education system. So we have to turn the people who want to protect the public education system, teachers and parents and students and community members, into an army that fights the big money, and it can be done.
Absolutely. It takes a village, right? And it takes, as Paulo Freire would say, first recognizing what are the issues, and then fighting that struggle to create hope. And that hope is brought together by individuals and in a collective way to address these oppressions. And so to give us and to offer us some hope, I like Rosalind Jackson from the Indiana Education Association to kind of leave us with some words that give us hope, but also a call to action.
Okay, thank you. And, you know, Dr. Cosby and Mr. Cohen, you both spoke about how can we stop charters. Well, Fort Wayne, Indiana, stopped a charter school from coming and setting up in their public school system. And how did they do it? They built a coalition. They had parents, students, their school board was behind them, their superintendent was behind them. And they said, but what helped a lot was the teachers that were also parents, to be able to talk from that perspective, being a teacher and what I want for my student, my child, with that. And also they put it everywhere. They let everyone know when the hearing was going to come up about the charter school. They flooded people's inboxes and mailers and say, hey, come out if you don't want this charter school here. Come out, because money is an issue when, you know, like you said, the candidates are backed. But if you start with that grassroots and you blast it to your parents, your community, your business members, and let them also, the people in the community where that charter school is going to be, let them come out and speak and tell how that charter school in that neighborhood is going to affect them, what it's going to do to that traditional community school that's there. So those are ways that you can definitely stop a charter. Also, as you know, call to action. So when you do leave this meeting, go and join the community, the IPS Coalition, the Indiana Coalition on Public Education. Join their mailing list and get on there so you can see information that is going. When you are local school boards, know about those meetings, know what those candidates are, show up to the school board meetings and put your voice there and back the candidates that you know that are going to be pro public education. We'll also have like other resources for you that you can use to go and join. It's about building the coalition. It's about going back and talking to your neighbor and saying, hey, if we don't want this charter school in here, or we want better public schools for our students, then we have to fight this, because the money definitely leaves the traditional public schools and it is hurting. So there is no failing schools. And I want people to take that and turn it around. The schools are not failing. It is the legislator and politicians and big companies with big money that's failing, because they're pouring money in to pull from the traditional public schools. So go and get involved in your local community, your community centers, go to your students, go to your student school, join that parent teacher association, know about what's going on. And like Dr. Cosby and Dr. Medina said, you need to know who are the candidates that's being backed by big money. You need to know who those organizations are so you can come up with a strategy and a plan also to attend their meetings and see exactly what they're talking about, because you can't beat an enemy that you don't know. And at this point, they are an enemy to public school funding, education. So those are some of the things that you can actually do. There is hope. So as long as you are putting the effort there, as long as you know that you're going to work toward not bringing that charter school or that innovation school into your network, because right now, as Dr. Cosby said, IPS, which is where I teach, we have 23 innovation network charter schools there. But that does not mean that as a teacher, we are going to give up, one, stopping any more to come, and two, trying to turn those schools back into the traditional public schools. Now, 23, and that's like a daunting task, but we are ready to fight for what's best for our students. Because as Dr. Medina and Mr. Cohen said, those schools are not set up for everyone. They have a zero tolerance policy, most of them. And when those students does not meet the mark of what they want, they kick them out. And then they come back to the traditional public school. And like Mr. Cohen said, but the money doesn't come back. You get the student, but you don't get the funding. And so that is a big piece. We can't fund our public schools if the money is being filtered out somewhere else. So that is the call to action. Get involved in your local community, talk to your neighbors. When schools send out, meetings, having community meetings, go to those meetings and see, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to stop something that you do not want, is to know what that is and to build that coalition to fight. You can't stand on your own. You're stronger as a coalition and together. And that is what you can do to stop those charters and innovations from coming into your community. With that, and with that being said, I do want to, at this time, thank the sponsors of this webinar, putting this on, the Indiana Coalition for Public Education, the IPS Community Coalition, the Indiana State Teachers Association, along with John Laughlin, Lori McGowan, Alan Scoff, and our full organizing committee that put this together. Also want to thank Dr. Gail Cosby for coming in and bringing her information in, as well as Mr. Cohen for coming in and giving us some information. And also go out and buy the book. It is an excellent book. I have it. It will give you some of the steps. It will give you some of the things that you can do, because reading that was very interesting to me, because I didn't realize the privatization was going on to the extent that it was. So you can use that as well, and resources and other resources that's in the chat that you can also click on that link to find the resources that'll help you fight. There are resources and people out there that are ready to push back and fight. You just have to band together and do it. Thank you.